The Middle Ages, a time of kings and castles, knights and peasants, faith and war. But beneath the romanticized image of medieval life lies a much harsher and more dangerous reality. For many who lived between the 5th and 15th centuries, life was short, brutal, and often deadly. And for those working in some of the most dangerous jobs of the era, simply surviving was an act of defiance against fate itself. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of the most perilous professions of the Middle Ages. These weren't glamorous positions. They didn't come with high pay, fame, or comfort. But someone had to do them, and those who did often paid the ultimate price, from plague doctors who braved deadly infections to castle workers laboring under the shadow of siege engines. We'll uncover the harsh realities faced by the forgotten laborers of history. Some of these jobs will surprise you, others are simply horrifying, but all of them serve as a stark reminder of how hard and how short life could be in the medieval world. Before we begin, I have one small request. Please watch this video all the way through. It's full of shocking, chilling, and even, at times, heroic stories. And when you finish, scroll down and tell me in the comments, how do you feel? Are you shocked, grateful, amazed, or maybe just relieved that you weren't born in the 14th century? Let's begin. Part 1. Filthy, gloomy, and horrifying. The first layer of medieval danger. Gong farmers, the men who shoveled human waste. Let's begin with one of the filthiest jobs in history, the gong farmer. In the Middle Ages, towns and cities lacked modern sewage systems. Instead, people relied on cesspits, deep, often narrow holes, located beneath homes or communal latrines, filled with years' worth of human waste. Those responsible for cleaning these cesspits were known as gong farmers. They typically worked at night, when the streets were quieter and the stench slightly less overpowering. Armed with shovels, buckets, and thick cloths wrapped around their mouths, they would descend into these dark pits. The job was physically exhausting and dangerously nauseating. Cesspits sometimes emitted toxic gases like methane or ammonia, which could knock a man unconscious, or worse, lead to death by suffocation or poisoning. In some cities, gong farmers were paid relatively well. However, they were social outcasts, often forced to live outside city walls and shunned by the public. They lived under constant threat of disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and the risk of cesspit walls collapsing, burying them alive in human filth. Few jobs were more disgusting. Fewer still were more dangerous. Plague doctors, birdbeak masks, and a desperate fight against the Black Death in the 14th century. The Black Death swept through Europe like wildfire. It is estimated that over 25 million people perished, nearly a third of the continent's population. Amid this horror, one profession gained grim notoriety: the plague doctor. Contrary to popular belief, plague doctors were not always trained medical professionals. Some were charlatans, others volunteers, and many were simply desperate men looking for work. They wore long, dark robes, gloves, and the now iconic bird-like masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender or mint, which were believed to protect them from miasma, the so-called bad air thought to cause the disease. These doctors traveled from town to town, tending to the dying, performing autopsies, and sometimes documenting the spread of the illness. But their protective gear was primitive and largely ineffective. Most plague doctors were infected within weeks or months and died horrific deaths. Being a plague doctor was essentially a gamble, a heroic and often suicidal attempt to combat something no one truly understood. Tanners, death and urine-soaked, misery leather was indispensable in the Middle Ages for shoes, belts, armor, saddles, bags, and bookbinding. But leather didn't come ready to use. It had to be processed, soaked, scraped, and tanned. And that's where the tanners came in. To tan hides, animal skins were soaked in a foul mixture of lime, dog feces, and urine to loosen the hair and soften the flesh. Workers would wade waist deep in these putrid vats for hours, scraping off flesh and soaking the hides with bare hands or primitive tools. The stench of a tannery could be detected from miles away. As you can imagine, this was both unpleasant and hazardous to health. The work was toxic. Prolonged exposure to lime could burn the skin and lungs. Fumes from decaying flesh carried bacteria and disease. Many tanners developed chronic illnesses, respiratory problems, or died prematurely. Despite being essential to medieval life, tanners were despised and often relegated to live in designated stinking quarters outside town. They wielded swords, axes, and ropes, the brutal instruments of public justice. Executioners held one of the most feared and misunderstood roles in medieval society, tasked with beheadings, hangings, and at times more gruesome punishments like quartering or burning. Executioners were both necessary and reviled. Though some held official titles and were paid by the crown, they were treated as social pariahs. They were banned from certain areas, could not marry into respectable families, and were excluded from public religious ceremonies. The physical danger was obvious. A misplaced axe swing, a botched execution, or an angry mob could all be fatal. Psychological trauma was another burden. Very few could kill for a living without consequences. Many executioners turned to alcohol or suffered mental breakdowns after years of service. It was a lonely and bloody profession, and few lived to old age while still in the trade. Miners, digging for wealth, buried by the earth mining, was vital for tool making, coin minting, and forging weapons. But medieval mining was a far cry from today's regulated industry. Deep shafts were dug with hand tools, wooden supports were unreliable, and ventilation was virtually non-existent. Miners worked long hours underground by candlelight, inhaling dust and toxic fumes from metal ores. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and flooding were common. Collapsing tunnels could bury dozens alive, and without modern rescue equipment, those trapped often died slowly, if not instantly. Mining for lead, silver, or mercury brought additional hazards. Poisoning, exposure to heavy metals caused madness, tremors, and agonizing deaths. Still, mining paid better than farming, and many were willing to take the risk. Unfortunately, many never returned. Siege engineers, builders of destruction on the front lines, When medieval kingdoms clashed, sieges were undoubtedly the most brutal form of warfare. Castles and walled cities became death traps, and the people who built the engines of destruction, siege engineers, stood at the forefront of danger. Their task? To construct massive war machines, catapults, battering rams, siege towers, and trebuchets, often right outside enemy walls. These towering structures had to be built quickly, using timber from nearby forests, all while under constant threat from flaming arrows, boiling oil, or sudden enemy assaults. Siege engineers were highly skilled in physics and material science, but they were also expendable. If a structure failed during an assault, engineers were often blamed. Worse still, if captured, they could be executed or tortured for their role in the destruction. Many wore no armor and worked in full view of archers atop the walls. It was technical brilliance, lived on the edge of death. Sappers, underground warriors, and the art of collapse. Sappers were a specialized branch of siege warfare. While engineers built above ground, sappers tunneled beneath enemy fortifications. Their mission was to dig shafts under castle walls, support them with wooden beams, then set them on fire to collapse the structure from below. This was one of the most claustrophobic and terrifying jobs imaginable. The tunnels were dug almost entirely in darkness. Oxygen was scarce. The walls were always at risk of collapsing. If defenders heard digging, they might dig counter tunnels and engage in brutal underground combat in pitch black. Fire was used both to destroy the supports and to smoke out any intruders. As if that weren't enough, sappers also had to contend with the toxic gas pockets, cave-ins, and choking dust. This was a hidden war, and death could come without warning. 8. Medieval sailors, storms, scurvy, and sea monsters. The open seas may seem romantic in legends and fairy tales, but for medieval sailors, the reality was terrifying. These men were the backbone of trade, war, and exploration. Yet, they carried out their duties on fragile wooden ships with almost no safety measures. Storms could sink ships within minutes. Navigation was extremely primitive. A wrong course could lead to shipwreck or starvation, often ending in disaster. Food and water would often spoil. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, rotted gums and led to painful deaths. Rats carried disease. And then there were the ruthless pirates, enemy fleets, and whispered legends of sea monsters in uncharted waters. Being adrift almost always meant death. Most sailors couldn't swim, and life jackets hadn't yet been invented. Many ships never returned, and few medieval sailors lived long lives. Salt workers, white gold, that cost-lived salt was incredibly valuable in the Middle Ages, so much so that it was sometimes used as currency. It preserved meat, fish, and other perishable foods before refrigeration, but extracting salt was incredibly dangerous. There were two main ways to gather salt: evaporating seawater and mining rock salt. The latter was especially nightmarish. Salt mines were extremely hot, humid, and unstable. The mineral itself irritated lungs, skin, and eyes, working deep underground in narrow, collapsing shafts. Miners faced the same dangers as metal miners, with the added risk of slow poisoning from salt dust. Salt burned from the inside and out. Even surface workers who boiled brine in large pans Over open flames risked heat stroke, explosions, and chronic lung diseases from inhaling steam and salt particles. But salt was so valuable that people lined up for the job. Poverty left them little choice. Payers, glassmakers, art in the shadow of fire. Glassmaking was a mysterious and revered craft, but one with deadly consequences. Glassmakers worked with molten sand and minerals at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees, 193 degrees. They spent hours each day in scorching workshops, inhaling toxic fumes from the lead and additives used in medieval glass formulas. Fires were a constant danger. If a mixture was unstable or cooled too quickly, explosions could occur. Burns were nearly guaranteed. Protective clothing was rudimentary, usually just wool or leather, and offered little defense against molten glass. Long-term exposure led to chronic lung diseases, blindness, and shortened lifespans. Glassmasters were praised for their skill, but behind every stained glass window was a workshop filled with men slowly dying from their own craft. 11. Leech collectors, wading through bloodsuckers in the swamp. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. In medieval medicine, leeches were essential. Doctors believed that bloodletting could cure everything from fevers to madness. But someone had to collect the leeches, and that job fell to leech gatherers. These workers waded into still ponds, marshes, and bogs, barefoot and bare-legged, allowing the leeches to attach to their skin. Once engorged with blood, the leeches were removed and stored for sale to doctors and apothecaries. It was not only disgusting, but dangerous. Collectors often lost dangerous amounts of blood, especially when multiple leeches latched on at once. Open wounds would become infected. The swamp water carried parasites. Snake bites, drowning, and malaria were real threats. And yet, this was a common job for the poorest people, especially women and children, who had few other options. 12. Fullers, breathing death while beating wool. Before it could be used in fabric production, wool had to be cleaned, softened, and thickened through a process known as fulling. This involved soaking the wool in vats filled with human urine. Yes, again, trampling it barefoot or pounding it with wooden paddles, then drying it into usable cloth. As you can imagine, it was filthy and hazardous work. Fullers spent hours standing ankle-deep in these vile tubs. The ammonia in urine caused chemical burns. Inhaling wool fibers and vapors led to a condition known as Fuller's lung, a painful and ultimately fatal respiratory disease. The combination of repetitive motion, toxic substances, and long hours in poorly ventilated rooms meant most Fullers died young, often after years of respiratory illness. Yet the textile industry needed them, and so thousands labored in silence, surrounded by the very product that was killing them. 13. Messengers and couriers, carrying death and secrets. Forget instant messaging and social media. Even the telephone and telegraph were centuries away. In the medieval world, the messenger's job was crucial. Kings, nobles, and generals all relied on these brave individuals to carry scrolls and messages across war zones, enemy lands, and untamed wilderness. The dangers? Countless. Messengers could be captured as spies, tortured, or even executed. They often traveled alone on horseback through roads infested with bandits or over treacherous mountain passes. During times of plague or invasion, towns might deny them entry for fear they carried disease or betrayal. Some bore letters sealed with royal wax. Others carried passwords or maps, making them prime targets for enemies. A single journey could bring riches and glory, or it could mean vanishing forever. Battlefield course collectors, cleaning up the carnage. After the battle ended and the victors had left the field, someone had to clean up the mess. The battlefield corpse collectors. These weren't soldiers. They were ordinary peasants, grave diggers, and prisoners forced into one of the most revolting jobs of the medieval world. The aftermath of medieval battles was horrifying. Thousands of corpses, both human and animal, would rot for days under the sun to prevent disease outbreaks, looting, and to salvage reusable armor and weapons. The bodies had to be removed. Collectors faced never-ending dangers, plague, infection, and the psychological trauma of handling corpses in various stages of decay. The injuries were often horrific. Limbs torn off, skulls crushed, entrails spilled, and there was no protective gear. The stench was unbearable. Rats and wild dogs ran rampant. One wrong step could mean slicing yourself on a blade still embedded in a corpse, a nearly certain death sentence from infection. No one volunteered for this job. It was a punishment and one of the most traumatic positions in all of medieval Europe. Charcoal burners, living with fire and smoke. Before widespread industrialization, charcoal was the primary fuel for blacksmiths, bakers, and furnaces. To produce it, charcoal burners were needed. Men who lived deep in the forests, tending to slow-burning stacks of wood known as charcoal clamps. These clamps had to be carefully built and slowly smoldered over days or even weeks. One moment of negligence could lead to an explosion or full ignition of the wood, destroying weeks of work and possibly killing nearby workers. Charcoal burners lived in complete isolation, inhaling thick, black smoke daily. Prolonged exposure caused lung cancer, throat cancer, and blindness. Fires and burns were common, and collapsing clamps could bury workers alive under smoldering debris. Despite their vital contribution to medieval industry, they were ghostly figures, covered in soot, breathing poison, and quietly dying slow deaths. Lime burners, toxic alchemy. In the countryside, lime was essential for mortar, plaster, and sanitation, but creating it from scratch was extremely dangerous. Lime burners heated limestone in specially constructed kilns until it turned into quicklime, a highly reactive and burning hot powder. Quicklime reacts violently with water, producing intense heat, enough to burn skin down to the bone. Lime burners often worked outdoors in windy conditions, using bare hands and cloth masks to shovel and move the material. Accidents were frequent. Kilns exploded. Inhaling lime dust caused blindness, respiratory failure, and deadly internal burns. A sudden rainstorm could transform stored lime into a blazing inferno. Despite the danger, demand was high. Castles, churches, and cities all needed lime, and so men risked their lives daily to keep the fires burning. Rat catchers, four-legged, plague rats were everywhere in the medieval world, in homes, stables, and granaries. But it wasn't just about protecting food. Rats were carriers of disease, most famously the bubonic plague. Catching them became a grim but necessary profession. Rat catchers worked in streets, sewers, and haylofts, armed with sticks, nets, and sometimes ferrets. Some kept trained dogs or cats. Others caught the creatures with their bare hands. There were many methods. They were constantly bitten and scratched by rats. Without antibiotics, rat bites often meant blood poisoning, tetanus, or worse, the plague itself. Ironically, some rat catchers spread disease more than they prevented it by transporting infested rats from one place to another. Their profession was so feared that some towns barred them from entering city gates during outbreaks. Yet when grain ran low or disease surged, they were summoned and paid in coins, food, or sometimes not at all. 18. Stonemasons, builders under siege cathedrals, castles, bridges, all required the hand of a medieval stonemason. Craftsmen who carved massive stone structures, raised columns, and balanced precariously on scaffolds hundreds of feet in the air. Masonry work in the Middle Ages was extremely dangerous. Workers hauled tons of stone using pulleys and wooden cranes. They often relied on primitive scaffolding, tied with rope or wedged into wall gaps. One mistake meant a deadly fall. Stone shards flew into their eyes, tools crushed fingers and fractured skulls. Limestone and granite dust damaged their lungs. The constant hammering and sawing could render them deaf within a few years. Still, it was considered a noble trade. Apprenticeship took years. Master masons were respected, but rarely safe. Some of the world's most breathtaking structures were built by the very people who died constructing them. Alchemists, breathing poison. In the pursuit of gold, before chemistry, there was alchemy, a mix of science, philosophy, and mysticism. Alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold, discover immortality, or create the elixir of life. Their experiments were fascinating and fatal. They worked with arsenic, mercury, sulfur, lead, and other toxic substances, often heating them in unventilated chambers. Explosions were common. Many died of poisoning or were burned alive in fires caused by unstable mixtures. Some alchemists were respected scholars. Others were frauds. All were viewed with suspicion, especially by the church, which saw their work as witchcraft. Accusations of sorcery often led to torture or execution. Those who didn't die by their own concoctions were sometimes hunted down by angry nobles who had funded their failed experiments. Knowledge was dangerous, and so was chasing the impossible. Bear leaders, traveling with beasts in medieval Europe, especially among traveling circuses and entertainers, animal performances were common. One particularly strange and wild profession was that of the bear leader. Bear leaders trained and transported bears from village to village for public shows, including dances and staged fights. The bears were kept on chains, frequently beaten, and were notoriously difficult to control. Trainers used muzzles, spiked collars, and cruel hooks to maintain dominance. But these were, after all, wild animals. Bear attacks were frequent. A momentary lapse in control or a startled reaction could result in a bear ripping off a limb or crushing a skull in seconds. Bear leaders also became targets of public violence or noble wrath if their performances went wrong. They lived constantly on the move, wandering performers with no permanent home or protection. Carters, navigating treacherous roads. Being a carter or wagon driver might sound straightforward, but in the Middle Ages, it was a perilous occupation. Carters were responsible for transporting goods across rugged terrain, through forests infested with bandits, and over collapsing wooden bridges. Carts would break down, wheels would shatter, axles would split. Drivers often had to repair them alone in the wilderness. When bandits attacked, most carters were either robbed or killed. In winter, roads were barely marked and often turned to thick mud. Accidents were common. Carts would tumble off cliffs. Drivers could be crushed under their own cargo, or they might be stranded miles from any help. Horses and oxen could panic, kick, or bolt in fear. And if the goods were spoiled or stolen, the carter could be beaten or even executed by enraged merchants. They were the backbone of commerce, and the job was a deadly gamble. Cooks in noble houses, fire, blades, and betrayal. Working in a castle kitchen might sound like a privilege, but in reality, it was a dangerous balancing act. Castle cooks worked in massive kitchens over open flames, using sharp knives, boiling oils, and deadly spits. Fires were frequent, burns were common, but worse still was the politics. If a noble died suddenly, whether from illness or suspicion, the cooks were often the first to be blamed. Many were accused of poisoning, even when innocent. Some were tortured, most were executed. There were food tasters, but they didn't eliminate the danger. Occasionally, a rival noble might bribe or threaten a kitchen worker to sabotage a meal. The kitchen wasn't just hot, it was a center of danger, deception, and survival. Executioners, the grim face of medieval justice. Executioners held one of the most feared and misunderstood professions of the medieval world. They sought to uphold justice through hanging, beheading, burning, breaking on the wheel, and more. Their work was gruesome and required precision. An inept execution could provoke public outrage or even incite rebellion. Despite enforcing the law, these men lived on the fringes of society. Because of their profession, they were often ostracized and sometimes forced to live outside city walls. They were seen as unclean, a walking symbol of death. Executioners also endured immense psychological strain. They witnessed horror upon horror. Some were forced to kill women, children, or even former friends. In addition, they were often responsible for torture prior to executions. They might break bones, remove body parts, or stretch victims on the rack. Sometimes these tortures lasted for days. Executioners acting as both tormentors and jailers. Despite the social stigma, executioners were usually well paid and sometimes passed their trade down through generations. Still, many died alone, hated and burdened with the darkest memories a man could carry. Gravediggers, the invisible, victims of plague and war. Just a step behind, the executioner stood the gravedigger, the final hands to touch the dead. In times of peace, they buried. The poor, in times of plague or war, their responsibilities multiplied to the thousands. During the 14th century, amidst the Black Death, gravediggers were among the most essential and endangered workers in Europe. With no understanding of microbes or disease transmission, they handled bodies covered in plague boils, vomit, and infected fluids. Many buried dozens of corpses each day, often in mass graves. They wore no gloves or masks. Every body they touched was a gamble with death. Most didn't survive more than a few weeks during major outbreaks. Sometimes they dug graves at night, burying the dead quickly under the cover of darkness to avoid panic or suspicion. In war zones, they gathered scattered limbs and partial remains from battlefields and towns. Yet despite the horror, most gravediggers were unpaid or compensated with scraps, food, shelter, or temporary protection from local lords. Like executioners, they were necessary but socially shunned, treated like shadows of death. Plague doctors, a cloak of fear, not protection. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, a terrifying figure emerged in response. The plague doctor, clad in the now iconic beaked mask, dark cloak, gloves, and staff. But despite the dramatic outfit, it offered little real protection. Plague doctors walked straight into the heart of infection zones. They visited homes filled with dying families, examined bodies covered in buboes, lanced boils, and drained wounds. The air around them reeked of death, decay, and despair. Their masks were filled with herbs and spices believed to protect them from miasma, the foul air thought to cause disease. In reality, they were fully exposed. Many died quickly. Worse still, plague doctors were often conscripted. Some volunteered, but most were forced into service by municipal councils and forbidden from leaving quarantine zones. Their duties included record keeping, confiscating property, and documenting the dead. While some plague doctors genuinely tried to help, others used the role to loot, steal, or even assault victims. The job was dangerous, morally ambiguous, and almost always fatal. Miners, digging towards death. Mining in the Middle Ages was literally a journey into hell. Whether Middle Ages miners were extracting silver, iron, lead, gold, or coal, they faced horrific working conditions. They often had to work hundreds of meters underground, in narrow, unstable tunnels, with very little ventilation and almost no light. Many mines were flooded, leading to drownings or collapses. Gas pockets would explode without warning. Workers used picks, hammers, and chisels, and any slip could cause falling rocks or fatal injuries. The air they worked in was filled with dust and poisonous particles. Lead miners suffered brain damage. Mercury miners went insane. Most miners developed lung diseases, arthritis, and blindness after squinting in the dark for years. And for what? Most were paid in tokens, redeemable only at the company store. Others were outright slaves or serfs, forced to work in the mines under the command of a lord. Very few miners lived to old age, 27. Tanners, leather and odor workers. In the medieval world, leather was everywhere, from armor to shoes to book covers. However, the men who made it, tanners, lived and died amid some of the worst filth imaginable. The leather tanning process involved soaking animal hides in a mixture of urine, feces, lime, and brain matter. The smell was so terrible and unbearable that tanneries were banned from city centers and were usually located in marshy, insect-infested areas downstream. Tanners stirred the vats with their bare hands or feet. Cuts and scratches easily became infected in this disgusting mixture. The ammonia from the urine burned their lungs and eyes. Skin diseases were also very common. Because of the smell, tanners were socially ostracized. They were banned from taverns, churches, and marketplaces. Many were forbidden from marrying into respectable families. Despite all this, tanners provided an essential service, but this came at the cost of their honor, health, and often their very names. Many tanners lost their identity and were nicknamed the Rotten Ones. Gong farmers, the night soil workers of the Dark Ages, perhaps the most disgusting and dangerous job. Gong farming, these were the men hired to clean latrines, cesspits, and human waste containers. Gong was a medieval term for feces. In cities, waste accumulated for months or years under wooden outbuildings or castle garderobes. Gong farmers descended into pits filled with rotting feces, dead animals, and disease, digging them out by hand or with buckets. They mostly worked at night because the stench was unbearable to the public. Cesspits often collapsed, burying people alive in sewage. If they carried torches, methane gas could ignite. Even without accidents, exposure to parasites, cholera, dysentery, and plague caused many to die young. Yet their work was vital for urban sanitation. Gong farmers earned good money, sometimes more than skilled laborers, but they died facing health risks, shame, and constant danger. Blacksmiths, hammer and flame blacksmiths, are often romanticized as muscular men shaping weapons and tools with fire and strength on their anvils. But medieval blacksmiths were exposed to one of history's most brutal workplaces. They stood for hours beside furnaces, hammering repeatedly with bone-crushing force. Temperatures rose above 1,500 degrees. Furnace fires sometimes exploded due to impurities in the metal or sudden drafts. Slag, molten waste, splattered and instantly burned their skin. Sparks could blind their eyes. The constant hammering noise led to hearing loss, and inhaling iron, dust, coal smoke, and toxic fumes caused deadly respiratory diseases. Despite all dangers, blacksmiths were highly respected. They crafted weapons, tools, horseshoes, armor, and even coins. Some were sought after by kings, but they paid a deadly price, with burns, disabilities, and broken bones. Night watchmen, guardians of the dark medieval cities, had no street lamps, telephones, or organized police. This duty fell to the night watchmen, poorly armed men patrolling city streets at night to maintain order and prevent crime or fires. They carried lanterns, staffs, or short swords, but they were rarely trained or equipped to handle real threats, leaving them vulnerable in serious situations. Thieves, murderers, drunken brawlers, and even wild animals roamed the streets at night. Fires could break out in wooden buildings and spread uncontrollably. Watchmen were often the first and only responders trying to do their jobs. When crime increased, they were the first to be blamed. If they failed to act, they could be whipped, fined, or dismissed. If they intervened, they risked being stabbed or ambushed. Many died on duty with little recognition or ceremony. Still, they were usually peasants or laborers earning a few coins to survive. They braved every shadow and scream without support. Shipbuilders, creating giants at risk. Every step of the way in the Middle Ages, the construction of ships, whether merchant vessels, fishing boats, or warships, required intense labor and exceptional precision. Shipbuilders were skilled craftsmen, but every day they faced risks such as death, fire, or crushing injuries. The timber had to be harvested from massive trees, transported, and then shaped using sharp tools like saws and broad axes. Lifting and positioning large beams demanded ropes, pulleys, scaffolding, and sheer physical strength. A single wrong move could crush a worker under tons of oak. Fires were a constant danger. Applying pitch and tar to make the ships waterproof often led to open flames and explosions. Workers slipped on slippery, sloped decks and risked falling into the shipyard waters or onto rocks below, resulting in serious injuries or death. Injuries included severed fingers, pierced limbs, blinded eyes, and broken backs. Despite the horrors, shipbuilders were indispensable, forming the backbone of a society striving to reach beyond its shores for trade, war, and exploration. Scribes and illuminators. Beauty at the cost of health. Medieval scribes and illuminators, though not often considered dangerous workers, were exposed to long-term health risks due to the materials they used and their working conditions. To create beautiful handwriting, illuminators used lead-based paints, powdered gold, mercury-rich pigments, and arsenic-based greens. These materials were handled by hand and sometimes applied with fine brushes. Repeated exposure caused mercury poisoning, neurological damage, and hallucinations. Scribes often worked in cold, damp scriptoria within monasteries, hunched over for long hours. Poor lighting strained their eyes, and unnatural postures over many years led to chronic pain, paralysis, and spinal deformities. Dust from vellum and pigments was constantly inhaled. Some scribes even went blind. Others suffered from migraines and tremors. And the beautiful manuscripts that have survived for centuries were mostly written by men who slowly died at their desks. Apothecaries. Playing with poison and hope. Medieval. Apothecaries were part pharmacist, part doctor, and part alchemist. They had to prepare medicines from plants, minerals, animal parts, and sometimes deadly substances such as arsenic, belladonna, mandrake root, and mercury. There were no regulations or safety guidelines. Apothecaries tasted and tested their own products. Many poisoned themselves as a result. A miscalculated dose could kill a patient, which could lead to public backlash, lawsuits, or executions for murder, especially when mixing aphrodisiacs, abortifacients, or magic powders. They often operated on the edge of legality. Church authorities sometimes regarded their work as witchcraft, and apothecaries were arrested, tortured, or forced to flee towns. Sometimes this even resulted in death. Despite the dangers of their profession, many were indispensable to their communities during plagues, childbirth, or wartime. Apothecaries were often the only source of care. Monastic brewers, brewing beer in deadly silence. In medieval Europe, monasteries brewed beer both for their own consumption and as a source of income. However, the role of a monastic brewer came with deadly risks. They worked in echoing stone chambers with boiling vats, open flames, and heavy barrels. Scalding accidents were common. Bursting barrels injured or even killed workers. Ventilation was poor, and constant exposure to yeast, mold, and fermentation gases inevitably led to lung infections and hallucinations. Brewers also worked silently under monastic rules, which meant they could not call for help immediately if they were injured or burned. Some even suffocated in fermentation vats when the fumes displaced the air. Still, their product was highly appreciated by the public, and beer was often safer to drink than water. Their sacrifice helped entire towns survive. Were candle makers, illuminating with fire and fat before electricity. Candles were essential for lighting. Chandlers, or candle makers, crafted them from tallow, animal fat, or beeswax. However, tallow was particularly unpleasant. It was made by boiling animal fat in massive cauldrons, mixed with lye and ashes. The boiling process released toxic fumes and often caused burns, infections, and respiratory issues. Exploding pots could douse workers in scalding fat. Workers frequently slipped on greasy floors or fainted from the stench. In urban workshops, fires often spread rapidly and engulfed entire neighborhoods, with candle makers frequently blamed. Yet without them, nights would have been dark, dangerous, and unproductive. Despite the dangers they faced, these craftsmen helped keep the medieval world, however dimly, alight. 36 millers, grain, gears, and greed mills powered by water or wind were critical to the food supply chain. However, working inside them as a miller came with dangers beyond dust and noise. The millstones could weigh several tons and spun at dangerous speeds. Gears could catch clothing, sever limbs, or crush skulls. Flour dust filled the air, and under the right conditions, it could ignite, causing massive explosions. Fires inside mills were notoriously devastating. Millers also faced social dangers. Since they controlled the food supply and could easily deceive customers by altering weights or taking extra grain, they were often accused of corruption. This sometimes led to public beatings, exile, or even lynching. There were millers who met a fatal end. Still, their job was crucial. Without flour, there was no bread, and without bread, there was famine. Messengers and heralds, crossing dangerous lands. In an age without instant communication, vital news and orders were carried by messengers and heralds, whether delivering royal decrees, declarations of war, or urgent messages. These men risked their lives on every journey. Roads were filled with bandits, wolves, hazardous weather, and hostile borders. A messenger caught at the wrong place, and time could be imprisoned, tortured, or killed on sight. They were often tasked with reading proclamations in enemy lands or among hostile villagers, an assignment that could mean facing arrows from castle walls or mob violence. Yet they were vital to politics and warfare, acting as the voice of kings, brave, unarmed, and alone. Messengers were the veins through which medieval society's lifeblood flowed. Bell ringers Death echoes in the belfry church bells marked time, warned of danger, and celebrated life. But for the bell ringers, the job was perilous. Bells were massive, often weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds. Ringing them required strength and coordination. Accidents occurred when ropes snapped, bells swung unexpectedly, or clappers broke loose and struck workers like hammers. Prolonged exposure to the deafening noise inside the bell tower caused permanent hearing loss, dizziness, or even brain damage. The towers themselves were dangerous. Many bell ringers died falling during long summer services or collapsed from heat stroke. When lightning struck a tower, as it often did, the bell room became one of the deadliest places to be. Fletchers, death by dust and repetition. Fletchers made arrows for archers and armies. The work was tedious and repetitive, shaping shafts, attaching feathers, and sharpening points. But it also involved constant exposure to feather dust, sharp tools, and toxic adhesives. Over time, fine dust from feathers and wood damaged their lungs. Glues, made from animal products and chemicals, caused skin rashes and respiratory failure. Fingers were frequently cut or crushed during carving and shaping. During wartime preparations, Fletchers worked at a frantic pace, with little rest and immense pressure. Falling behind could endanger entire armies. Though not a glamorous job, their work shaped victory or defeat and often shortened their own lives. Watchmen, alone with storms and sky, perched atop towers, castles, ships, and city walls. Watchmen were responsible for warning of approaching enemies, fires, or natural disasters. Their job demanded intense focus and carried a heavy burden. Many froze to death or were struck by lightning atop high towers. Falls were common. A single misstep, a collapsing railing, or a moment's drowsiness could result in a fatal plunge. Living in isolation for hours or even days, they endured bitter cold or extreme heat. During sieges, they were targeted by enemy archers. During storms, by nature's fury. Their cries of warning could mean the difference between survival and slaughter, yet they were almost never remembered. Clockmakers, taming time, with iron and precision. As late medieval Europe marched toward modernity, public clocks became symbols of progress. But the craftsmen behind these marvels, clockmakers, were doomed to walk a fine line between genius and catastrophe. These artisans worked with intricate gears, massive weights, and delicate escapement mechanisms, all designed to tick in harmony. Clock towers were tall and steep, dark and freezing, with enormous iron components hanging above. A misaligned gear could snap, a falling weight could crush a body instantly, and errors meant dangerous climbs by candlelight to make repairs. On top of the mechanical dangers came the psychological strain. A clockmaker who failed to keep time could face blame, loss of reputation, or even punishment, especially if the townsfolk relied on the bell for church or war summons. Yet these masters of time risked their lives to bring order to chaos. Crusaders, soldiers of faith, martyrs of war. To bear the cross in the name of faith was seen as sacred, but joining a crusade often led to a bloody, disease-ridden death far from home. crusaders endured brutal marches, scorching heat, icy mountain passes, and battles against enemies who knew the terrain far better. Diseases, especially dysentery and plague, killed more soldiers than swords ever could. Water sources were contaminated. Food was scarce. Many died from heat stroke, starvation, or poisoned wells. Religious zeal did not shield them from the very human consequences of war. Some crusaders were tragically killed by their own commanders, while others were enslaved when captured. Few returned. Fewer came back whole. It was a job cloaked in sanctity, but for many, it was a shortcut to an early grave. Town watchmen, enforcers on the edge. Medieval cities relied on watchmen to patrol at night, light lamps, watch for fires, and stop crimes. But they did all this unarmed, poorly paid, and alone. They were the first to arrive at murder scenes, riots, robberies, and disturbances. Watchmen were ambushed by gangs, attacked by drunkards, or killed by arsonists they tried to stop. Their job could be dull one minute, deadly the next. During plague years, they became quarantine enforcers and sometimes corpse collectors. This made them both feared and hated. Without armor or weapons, they relied on loud voices and luck, and many died forgotten in the back alleys of their cities. Falconers, hunting in the arms of death, training birds of prey, was a noble art, but it was also incredibly dangerous, especially when falconers worked with hawks, eagles, or gyrfalcons. These birds were wild, aggressive, and unpredictable. Falconers were often clawed, pecked, or blinded by their own animals. They climbed cliffs, entered forests, and chased game across perilous terrain. One bad fall could break a leg or a neck. They lived in solitude, often camping in the wilderness, facing risks from wild animals, bandits, or starvation. Yet they were indispensable to noble courts and valued for their connection to both nature and strategy. The wounds of a falconer, limping for life, were seen as a badge of pride. Traveling artists, applause or acts, jesters, minstrels, actors, and troubadours brought music and laughter. But in the Middle Ages, being a traveling performer was anything but safe. They had to traverse dangerous roads, sleep outdoors, or in unstable inns, and were often seen as strangers, heretics, or spies. A poorly received performance, especially in a noble's court, could lead to beatings, imprisonment, or even execution. Some were accused of witchcraft, particularly if their tricks or songs offended church authorities. Others were simply robbed, killed, or exiled for being entertainers in a world that often didn't want to be entertained, and yet they performed because the alternative was silence, and silence was worse. In conclusion, a dangerous world forged in blood and toil. The Middle Ages weren't just about kings and castles. They were, quite literally, built on the backs of workers who risked their lives every single day. From miners to executioners, falconers to gravediggers, their jobs were not only dangerous, but often deadly. Many died young. Others lived in pain, exile, or silence. But without them, cathedrals would crumble, roads would vanish, and kingdoms would fall. So, the next time you look at a medieval town in a painting or a film, remember this: every stone, every sword, every story was made real by someone who risked everything to make the impossible possible.